Think before you speak, read before you think. Fran Lebowitz, author, public speaker, and actor. All right, welcome to another morning episode of the Liberty Dad podcast, a discussion on politics and culture. If you're tuning in live, I want to especially thank you for giving me your time so early. Yesterday, we learned about the Supreme Court and Trump and immunity. Well, we sort of learned about it. What what I think we learned was that a lot of people are averse to reading, but they're not averse to talking. Oh no. So let me show you what kind of just triggered me, if you will, to talk about what I want to talk about today, which is not so much the immunity case itself. I want to talk about how we as Americans approach this kind of information because I find it a little bit frustrating. So let me show you a tweet from somebody. His name is Harry Sisson. I think it's how you say his last name. And he's a young guy. He's like, I don't know, 22, and he's kind of popular. He's got a big following and he posts stuff and he's like super duper hardcore, like vote blue no matter who. Biden's awesome. I mean, he just like all the little catchphrases. He says them all the time. After the debate, he was like, man, Biden did so great. I mean, he's just all in. I mean, a lot of people accuse him of being like some sort of paid personality or whatever. And maybe that's the truth. I don't really know. And I don't really care, to be perfectly honest with you. Like, he's just some kid. He's out there. Whether he believes it or not really relevant to me. I don't really care. But here's this tweet that he put out. And I want to just kind of show you some things here because I found it kind of amazing. He says, according to the, let me adjust my there we go, so I can see it better. He said, according to the Supreme Court, Biden could now send in SEAL Team 6 to take all of them out. He could send in the military to take out Trump. He has immunity for official acts now. Okay, that sounds pretty wild. That's an interesting interpretation of that, right? So, what I found interesting about this is that the responses, not so much his comment, like whatever, but it was the responses to this. So let me pull up some of these responses because I think they're amazing, and I think that they show that America has a problem that we're not willing to read. So let's kind of scroll back here. Let me pull this up. There we go. All right. So let's go down to the bottom here. So Chris La Civita, who is Trump's campaign manager, said, "Expect a visit." Oh goodness, that sounds pretty serious. Then we got the ever so awesome cat turd. He says, "Hey FBI and Secret Service, this is an open call by Harry J. Sisson to assassinate President Trump." Hmm? Hey Elon Musk, how is this not permanent suspension? Well, that's interesting. Laura Loomer, she says, Elon Musk, this is a ban worthy tweet. It's a felony to call for the assassination of a U.S. president. Harry J. Sisson should be punished for this. Then I said, worse than a kid like Harry failing reading comprehension and retarded adults like La Savita and Laura Loomer failing reading comprehension. I'm sorry, I read it. Worse than a kid like Harry failing reading comprehension are retarded adults. I read it awkwardly. I apologize. Are retarded adults like La Savita and Laura Loomer failing reading comprehension. I'd say they should expect to be dropped on their heads, but clearly that's already happened. And then I quoted them. I just put screenshots of their stuff. So now why is this bothering me so much? Why am I so worried about some kid on the internet saying goofy things? Well, it wasn't so much that I was worried about what he had to say. I was like really annoyed that all the responses seemed to be like, man, I can't believe he's calling for the assassination of the president. But he's not, actually, and this is the problem. So let's go back to his tweet, and let's just take a look, and we're just gonna see, like, I can we determine whether or not this is actually an open call for, to clicking on different things here. I apologize, I'm getting a little bit discombobulated. Let's see what he says. Let's read it again. He said, "According to the Supreme Court," right? That's not like, "Hey, I would like this to happen." That's according to the Supreme Court, Biden could now send in SEAL Team 6 to take them all out. He could send in the military to take out Trump. He has, quote, immunity for official acts now. Okay? That's not a call. That's saying, according to what these people over here said, this guy is allowed to now do this. That's not a call to assassinate anybody. Now, I suspect that everybody that, and there was a whole bunch of quote tweets, and they all basically say the same thing, right? I'm sure Elon, hopefully, I suspect that Elon Musk is very good at reading, read the tweet, rolled his eyes, and moved on. Okay, because Harry's still there, hasn't been suspended, and he shouldn't be, because he's not actively calling for the assassination of anybody. What he's doing, he's repeating what was in the Supreme Court ruling regarding Trump and immunity. So let's take a look at that and see what is it. I mean, maybe he's referencing, maybe let's just see what he's referencing. Let's just take a look. Let's just go there. So here it is. Supreme Court ruling. This is on page 96. That's 119 pages. I haven't read the whole thing. I've kind of skimmed around. I've probably read, I don't know, 20, 25 pages worth. It's kind of skipping around a little bit. I started reading some of the some of the opinions of the six judges who voted to give him, basically give him immunity, or their ruling on immunity. I read Sotomayor's dissent. I read part of Jackson's dissent. So here is what Harry is referring to. So this is under, let's see, where are we here? This is this is Sotomayor's, in part of Sotomayor's dissent. So she said, the president of the United States is the most powerful person in the country and possibly the world. When he uses his official powers in any way under the majority's reasoning, he now will be insulated from criminal prosecution. Orders the Navy's SEAL Team 6 to assassinate a political rival, immune. Organizes a military coup to hold on to power, immune. Takes a bribe in exchange for a pardon, immune, 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 immune. Okay, now, a little dramatic in my opinion, but that's what Justice Sotomayor was saying. So the question here, since everybody's on Twitter and they're like, oh my God, look what Harry said. He's calling for the assassination of the president. Is Justice Sotomayor calling for the assassination of the president? No, she is not. She is describing, in her opinion, what she believes the effect of the um, majority's reasoning would lead to, or could lead to. She's speculating. She's creating a hypothesis. Oh, well, if this is going to stand, then this is what we can potentially expect. Like this is how far it could go. Now, I'm not so sure that I agree, and we'll touch upon that just in a wee bit. But before I do that, before we like, I'm not going to get too deep into this opinion because I haven't read it enough. I mean, I've only read like maybe 20, 25 pages, and it's 119 pages. So I've only read like what, about a sixth of it? That's not enough, really. And then when you read these kind of rulings, they often refer to prior court cases. So sometimes, like sometimes it's good to if you're trying to understand a particular section and like where their logic is, you kind of got to read those things too. I mean, you can get away with just reading this whole 119 pages, and you can probably get as a lay person, you can probably walk away with a good understanding, not a firm one. I mean, not going to be a lawyer all of a sudden, but you have a good firm understanding because the power of reading. And so what bothers me is not that, like, I get it. People get on Twitter, they say things. Harry is their rival. I don't think he's a particularly strong rival, but he's a rival because he's out there supporting Biden. But everybody gets out there and they're like, oh man, he's calling for the assassination of the president. And then when you look at the responses to those tweets, you don't see a lot of people going, okay, look, that's not really what he said. I mean, like, there's just a bunch of cheers, like, yeah, yeah, we should totally get him. I'm like, what the hell kind of society do we have? Well, as it turns out, it's actually nothing new. The society that we have is the society that we've always had. So let's take a look at this. Let me pull it up here real quick. We're gonna pull up this document. This comes from Isaac Asimov. He wrote it in 1980. It's a short article. I'm going to read it for you. Okay, and we'll put it up on the screen so that you can see it as well. And what I want you to really pay attention to his words and just this was written in 1980. Okay, so 44 years ago. I want you to just see if it sounds at all anything like society today. Okay, because I personally think it does, and I will have everything linked in the show notes so that you could check it out yourself. But I encourage you to read it, maybe even bookmark it, and I come back to it often. If you follow me on Twitter, you've probably seen me. If you follow me on Twitter for like, I don't know, the last 8 months, somewhere in there, I've probably reposted a clip of it or mentioned it. So let's go ahead and pull this up and we're going to read it. The title of it is A Cult of Ignorance. I'm going to zoom in so that so that you can see the words if you just happen to be, like actually looking at it. And I'll also read it if you're just kind of looking away. So give me a second here as I zoom in. So let's zoom in so that we get it. All right, perfect. There we go. It's hard. I'm reading now. So I'm going to be reading this whole article. It's not very long. I promise you it's worth your time to listen or read it if you so choose, or both, which I recommend. All right, let's go. Cult of Ignorance. It's hard to quarrel with that ancient justification of the free press, America's right to know. It almost seems cruel to ask, ingenuously, America's right to know what, please? Science? Mathematics? Economics? Foreign languages? None of those things, of course. In fact, one might well suppose that the popular feeling is that Americans are a lot better off without any of that tripe. There is a cult of ignorance in the United States, and there always has been. The strain of anti intellectualism has been a constant thread winding its way through our political and cultural life, nurtured by the false notion that democracy means that, quote, my ignorance is just as good as your knowledge, end quote. Politicians have routinely striven to speak the language of Shakespeare and Milton as ungrammatically as possible in order to avoid offending their audiences by appearing to have gone to school. Thus, Adlai Stevenson, who incautiously allowed intelligence and learning and wit to peep out of his speeches, found the American people flocking to a presidential candidate who invented a version of the English language that was all his own and that has been the despair of satirists ever since. George Wallace, in his speeches, had as one of his prime targets the pointy headed professor, and with that, and with what a roar of approval that phrase was always greeted by his pointy headed audience. Buzzwords. Now we have a new slogan on the part of the obscurantist. Don't trust the experts. 10 years ago, it was don't trust anyone over 30. But the shouters of that slogan found that the inevitable alchemy of the calendar converted them to the untrustworthiness of the over 30. And apparently, they determined never to make that mistake again. Don't trust the experts is absolutely safe. Nothing, neither the passing of time nor exposure to information, will convert these shouters to experts in any subject that might conceivably be useful. We have a new buzzword too for anyone who admires competence, knowledge, learning, and skill, and who wishes to spread it around. People like that are called elitist. That's the funniest buzzword ever. Let me scroll back up here and move this over a little bit, just a moment. That's the funniest buzzword ever invented. There we go. Because people who are not members of the intellectual elite don't know what an elitist is or how to pronounce the word. As soon as someone shouts elitist, it becomes clear that he or she is a closet elitist who is feeling guilty about having gone to school. All right, then forget my ingenuous question. America's right to know does not include knowledge of elitist subjects. America's right to know involves something we might express vaguely as what's going on. America has the right to know what's going on in the courts, in Congress, in the White House, in industrial councils, in the regulatory agencies, in labor unions, in the seats of the mighty, generally. Very good. I'm for that too. But how are you going to let people know all that? Grant us a free press and a core of independent and fearless investigative reporters, comes the cry, and we can be sure that the people will know. Yes, provided they can read. As it happens, reading is one of those elitist subjects I've been talking about, and the American public, by and large, in their distrust of experts and in their contempt for pointy head professors, can't read and don't read. To be sure, the average American can sign his name more or less legibly and can make out the sports headlines. But how many non elitist Americans can, without undue difficulty, read as many as 1,000 consecutive words of small print, some of which may be trisyllabic? Moreover, the situation is growing worse. Reading scores in the schools decline steadily. The highway signs, which used to represent elementary misreading lessons, go slow, X road, are steadily being replaced by little pictures to make them internationally legible and incidentally to help those who know how to drive a, let me scroll back up to the top here, how to drive a car, but not being pointy headed professors can't read. I said that a little awkwardly, pardon me. Again, in television commercials, there are frequent printed messages. Well, keep your eyes on them, and you'll find out that no advertiser ever believes that anyone but an occasional elitist can read that print. To ensure that more than this Mandarin minority gets the message, every word of it is spoken out loud by the announcer. Honest effort. If that is so, then how have Americans got the right to know? Grant there are certain publications that make an honest effort to tell the public what they should know, but ask yourselves, how many actually read them? There are 200 million Americans who have inhabited schoolrooms at some time in their lives and who will admit that they know how to read, provided you promise not to use their names and shame them before their neighbors. But most decent periodicals believe they are doing amazingly well if they have circulations of 500,000. It may be that only 1% or less of Americans make a stab at exercising their right to know. And if they try to do anything on that basis, they are quite likely to be accused of being elitist. I contend that the slogan, America's right to know, is a meaningless one when we have an ignorant population. And the function of a free press is virtually zero when hardly anyone can read. What shall we do about it? We might begin by asking ourselves whether ignorance is so wonderful after all, and whether it makes sense to denounce elitism. I believe that every human being with a physically normal brain can learn a great deal and can be surprisingly intellectual. I believe that what we badly need is social approval of learning and social rewards for learning. We can all be members of the intellectual elite, and then, and only then, will a phrase like America's right to know, and indeed any true concept of democracy, have any meaning. This was written in 1980. I want you to think about what you just heard. Does that at all sound like where we are today? We have a cult of ignorance. Now, look, I disagree with Harry on a great many things, like virtually everything. I don't know. I mean, I'm sure there's a tweet out there that I would go, okay, yeah, that's correct. But I disagree with him on a lot. But I sure as heck am not going to sit here and read his tweet and then say, oh man, he's trying to assassinate the president. No, he's not. And anybody that pushes that garbage should be ridiculed because they probably know better. I doubt that Laura Loomer or Cat Turd or any of the other people who were calling for him to be removed really believe that he was calling for the assassination of the president. But I'm not so convinced that their followers realize it. And we're not even talking about whether or not it's a true threat, which I believe is a legal concept. But let's think about it in more lay terms. Does anybody really believe that's what he was calling for? When he almost wrote verbatim what a Supreme Court justice wrote in their dissent? I mean, I didn't believe it, and I've seen some of his posts. I don't think that he's ever called for the assassination of anybody. So the idea is absurd on its face, and we should call it out when we see it. Because if we don't call it out, then we're going to end up being the ones that get bamboozled because we're allowing this cult of ignorance to play out. And I want you to think about something for a minute. We just came out of COVID. Remember all the calls like, don't, man, my jacket's all messed up here. I'm looking kind of disheveled. There we go. How about that? Remember all the calls like, don't, don't do your own research, trust the experts. And people were like, no, no, I'm going to do my own research. And you should. We should all do our own research as much as we can. Now, like we don't all have the time. Like it's a 119-page ruling. Do I have the time to read that? And then maybe read some of the previous court rulings before it got to the Supreme Court? Probably not. But I can at least read a friggin' tweet and I can say, okay, yeah, he's not calling for the assassination. And I'm going to call out anybody that says so because we can do better. How are I want you to think about this. And you might be like, "Dio, why are you making such a big stink about this?" Because if we can't demand intellectual honesty with a tweet, then how do we know that these same people, let's say they read the ruling, how do we know that they know what they're talking about? That they're not applying the same intellectual dishonesty or laziness, take your pick. How do we know that they're not applying that same intellectual failing to reading the ruling? We don't. This is why it's important to read. This is why it's important to be vigorous in our debate. I love the part in Asimov where he said, I love the part in Asimov's article where he says, I believe that every human being with a physically normal brain can learn a great deal and can be surprisingly intellectual. I believe that what we badly need is social approval of learning and social rewards for learning. We came out of COVID and there were not social approval. There was not any level of social approval for learning or rewards for learning. Right. And people tried to read some of the information. They would go to the CDC, they would go to these other places and they would try to read stuff. And sometimes they got it wrong. And that's okay. Better to get it wrong than not try at all. I want people to read. Keep reading. Because today, on July 2nd, 2024, If this is the first time that you decide that you're going to read a Supreme Court ruling, you're going to get a lot wrong. But if you continue to do it, you will start to pick up stuff. And if you evaluate what you've read and how you understood it to other people, go onto YouTube, watch some videos, check things out, read other people's opinions when they write them. When you do those things, eventually you will start to become that surprisingly intellectual person. And depending on where you are today, depending on how much time you put in, you could be surprisingly intellectual in months, or it might take a few years. Whatever the case, it's always a good thing. Reading is always a good thing, and we do not do enough of it. But then after we read, we need to make sure that we're applying a meaningful comprehension to what we've read. And then we communicate a meaningful comprehension to other people. And when somebody doesn't, we need to call them out and say, that's garbage. Every one of those people should have been laughed at. There is no reason at all that this young kid who is not calling for the assassination of the president, there is no reason at all that he should be getting a visit from Secret Service, the FBI, or anybody else. Elon Musk hopefully rolled his eyes and said, whatever. And anybody with any intellectual honesty and integrity would have done so themselves as well. Now, that doesn't mean you can't disagree with them and say, look, that's not really like you. It's okay to disagree and say, okay, well, you know what? I don't believe that's what this ruling leads to. That's fine. Like that's part of having this right to know and being, aware of what our government's doing and what's happening in society. Sometimes you will get it wrong, but the more effort you put in, the better you'll get. But the first thing is we have to read and to be honest and understand what we've actually read and hold people accountable when their reading is very blatantly and obviously nonsense. Like what they're communicating to us is garbage. So, about the Supreme Court ruling. Well, it's 119 pages, but I did happen to find a video that I think kind of summarizes it pretty well from what I can tell. And it seems pretty objective. So I'm going to play this video. It's about a 4-minute video, and I might stop it from, time, as we're playing it. But it comes from the Wall Street Journal, and they just kind of give what I think is a relatively objective overview of the ruling so that kind of like 10,000 foot level, what happened here? What's going on? Now, I still encourage you to go read it for yourself. And if nothing else, skip around. Right? I mean, it's 100. I get it. It's 119 pages. And, are you going to go back and read any of the additional rulings? Most people probably not. But if you read 5 pages, 5 from this ruling, you will be better off than many of the people that are commenting who simply watched a video or made an assumption of what it means. And I think a lot of people, what they do is they look for. I think people fall on the lines of my team, your team, and I don't think this is a good idea if we want to be an informed society. So let's take a look at this video, and I'll make a couple comments after, or maybe during the video. All right, so let's see here.
Delivered a heavy blow to special counsel Jack Smith's election interference case against former President Donald Trump, ruling along partisan lines that Trump has broad immunity for acts taken while he was in office.
This will be referred to from now on as a landmark opinion of the Supreme Court. It's not only important for President Trump's criminal case, they really have set a framework for all future presidents.
Okay, so I think this is the first thing to recognize. I've seen people online and they're like, this is going to make Trump a king. No, this applies to all presidents, first and foremost. And so when the squawking is over what's going to happen with Trump, it's not guaranteed. They're just making a projection of what they think, and they're applying it because the case did come about through an indictment of Trump. So let's continue.
August 2023, a federal grand jury indicted Trump in an unprecedented criminal case, charging the former president with 4 crimes related to his alleged attempts.
All right, so here are the 4 crimes. Let's read them: conspiracy to defraud the United States, conspiracy to obstruct an official proceeding, obstruction of an attempt to obstruct an official proceeding, and conspiracy against rights. So those are the 4 things. We're not going to have to get into them, but now you know, okay, what's the basis for this ruling in the first place? The basis is these 4 indictments, and you can go and you can read up exactly what they are, how they're applied, so on and so forth. Okay, but this is where it comes from, and the ruling is again applied to any president from yesterday forward.
To overturn the 2020 election.
Donald Trump's defense team puts forward this argument that a former president should be held completely immune from prosecution for any of the acts that they performed while in office.
I feel that as a president, you have to have immunity. Very simple.
After a lower court rejected Trump's immunity claims, the former president appealed, and on July 1st, the Supreme Court gave him a sweeping amount of protection against criminal prosecution.
The court's very explicit about this.
Okay, I want you to see something here, and if you can't see it because maybe you're just listening in the background, I'll tell you about it. The lawyer here has a printout of the court case, and it looks like he's got like notes and stuff like that. You can see some looks like post-it notes or something sticking off the side. So he has read this, and it looks like probably highlighted certain things. This is how you become an informed person. Like the most if you want to be the most informed person. Now, yeah, I get it. You can use a PDF reader and you can basically do the same thing, but effectively you need to do the same thing. Either print it out, highlight it up, chew it up, digest it, or do it digitally. But he read this, so he knows what he's talking about, or at least he has an idea. Now, whether or not he's correct, well, that's subjective based on people reading the document itself. But it sounded to me like he was pretty objective, so I'm playing the video for you.
It lays out its framework by saying, quote, "The nature of presidential power entitles a former president to absolute immunity from criminal prosecution for actions within his conclusive and preclusive constitutional authority." What the court is saying in this part is quite surprising. They're basically saying that nothing he does in terms of pressuring the Justice Department to investigate whoever he wants to investigate as president can ever be subject to criminal liability.
The High Court's opinion also says that Trump is entitled at a minimum to presumptive immunity from prosecution for all his official acts. However, a court could determine that some conduct, such as a campaign speech or fundraising, constitutes an unofficial act.
Okay, so this is where we get into some of the distinctions on whether or not a president can be prosecuted. So again, as you heard, if it's an official act, then they've got immunity. And the court, the majority goes through and they explain why they believe that it's necessary. Ultimately, it boils down to something very, very simple. They say, look, if we want our president to be able to do his job without worrying about, oh my God, am I going to get, is somebody going to try to come after me later for making this decision? Then we need to give him immunity. That's basically, that's kind of like a summary of what I read. Okay, it goes into it in more in depth, talking about prior cases and prior case law and so on and so forth. Okay, but the distinction now is not he doesn't. He has immunity, and so therefore he's necessarily the king. They do specify that it is immunity on official acts, but not unofficial acts, as we'll find out.
The Supreme Court says, quote, "The president enjoys no immunity for his unofficial acts, and not everything the president does is official."
Okay, so that's very, very important when we're having this conversation. Now the question, so my understanding, how I read this in the various videos that I watched to cheat, but I did read a bunch of it. My impression is that what the Supreme Court ruled is said, look, there are official actions and there are unofficial actions. Unofficial actions, you have no immunity for. So if it's not part of your job, you have no immunity. If it is part of your job, then you do have immunity. And so now what the Supreme Court did was they kicked it back and they said it needs to be decided what things were either official acts or unofficial acts. When he's speaking to his crowd on January 6th, was that an official act as the president, or was that an act that was unofficial as a candidate? And the court has to make that determination.
End quote. So a big question here is, when was President Trump acting in his official capacity as president of the United States versus when was he acting as candidate for reelection?
We will never concede. It doesn't happen. You don't concede when there's theft involved.
When President Trump gives his speech at the Ellipse on January 6th and suggests to his supporters to go to the Capitol, is he speaking as political candidate or is he speaking as president? The majority opinion doesn't tell us which. They give the lower courts some quote unquote guidance, but that will be a key determination as to whether that can even be part of the allegations, even part of the evidence that could be used at trial.
The court's 3 liberal justices could barely contain their outrage. The dissenters said the majority opinion makes a mockery of the principle foundational to our Constitution and system of government that no man is above the law. Having won from the court nearly everything he could have hoped for, Trump celebrated in a Truth Social post, writing, "Big win for our Constitution and democracy." President Biden called the court's decision a terrible disservice to the people of this nation.
Today's decision almost certainly means that there are virtually no limits on what the president can do. This is a fundamentally new principle, and it's a dangerous precedent.
The ruling sends the case back to federal district judge Tanya Chutkan in Washington.
The next step is for Judge Chutkan to engage in what we call fact-finding. She will now apply the Supreme Court's framework to the allegations to determine what is official versus unofficial conduct. If it is official conduct, is it absolutely immune? If it's not absolutely immune, is it presumptively immune? And if it's presumptively immune, could the government rebut the presumption? That's all a hodgepodge of very difficult legal questions. I think it's inconceivable that there will be a criminal trial before the election.
If Trump is elected to a second term, experts say he has several options to quash the case.
President Trump would be the head of the executive branch of the Justice Department. He could order the Justice Department just to stand down. He could say on day one, I have determined this was a witch hunt. President Trump could potentially try to issue a self-pardon. That's more controversial, and even the Justice Department in the distant past has said that a president cannot pardon himself.
All right. So there's your 4-minute summary of the ruling. That gives you an idea of what it is that the Supreme Court actually said, so that you have an idea of what they said and what they didn't say. However, to get the best interpretation would be to read it yourself. And when you read it, you need to apply all the same fundamentals of reading that you would anywhere else. And we shouldn't give anybody any slack. Now, when it comes to a tweet, I mean, is it really that big of a deal that a lot of people are misinterpreting what Harry wrote? Yes, it is that big of a deal. Because if you're that lazy for something so simple, or you're that dishonest, again, take your pick. But if you're not going to put in the rigor of reading and understanding and comprehending what you've read for something as simple as a tweet, then how the heck should I believe some of these people that they understand what the ruling means? It's 119 pages. It relies on prior court cases and precedent. And so, like, it's nice to play the video that I did with a legal, I believe is a legal professor at NYU. It's nice to play those videos and get a nice idea, an overview of, okay, what does this ruling say? And maybe you are being, you as an audience member, you are like, look, I can't read everything, which I get it. I can't read everything either, right? I've got a job and a family, and sometimes I like to go out and hang out with some friends. I got a life to live, so I cannot read everything. But you should read some things. And when you read something, you should take care in how you understand it and communicate it. Whether it's as simple as a tweet or as serious as a Supreme Court ruling that puts out there, this question of to what degree is the president immune from liability, like immune from legal liability? And I think if we're not willing to do that, then I kind of agree with Asimov. We don't really have much of a right to know. If we're not going to put ourselves in a position to even try, then why would we claim we have any right to any knowledge whatsoever? It doesn't matter whether it's a Supreme Court ruling or COVID and the origins of it, or whether or not this particular COVID vaccine is a good vaccine. Has it been tested thoroughly? Whatever the case may be, we can't really claim that we have a right to know this kind of stuff if we don't put in the effort to actually know it and then actually communicate it correctly. And what you do in the small things bleeds over into what happens with the big things. So a tweet is indicative of how you will treat something more serious. That's it. That's the point today. You need to read when you can, and when you do, read it well, comprehend it, and communicate it correctly. And then hold others accountable when they don't. And it doesn't matter what it is. It doesn't matter if it's a postcard from your good friend who's on vacation, right? Reading is a skill that we all can have, that we can all develop. Some of us are better at it than others. I can read relatively quickly. Other people I know, they don't read so fast, and that's okay. The point is to take where you are today and be better tomorrow, next week, next month, next year than you are today. You should always be better and better and better. And then you will be an informed person. And when we have an informed population, then we can hold our elected representatives accountable. We can make noise. It means something. If I'm a fool, like imagine, again, let's go back to this tweet, and we're going to wrap it up here in a second. But go back to the tweet. Imagine that I were to call up the FBI, Secret Service, or some hotline, and I were to be like, man, somebody just threatened the president of the United States. And they're like, oh, yeah? And I go, oh, yeah. You got to see this tweet. I'm going to send you the information. What's the email that I can send it to? Whatever, right? And so then I send the information. Somebody on the other end, they take it, they go look, and they have to, maybe they have procedures that they have to follow, right? Like they have to take a tip and they have to run with it correctly. So that they may not, like, I'm making an assumption at this particular moment, but assume for a moment that there are procedures, which there should be procedures. And the person on the other end takes it, they read it. Their initial impression is, okay, that guy that just called me DL, he doesn't really understand what this is saying. It's not a threat to the president. However, because I've now received it, it has to go through all the proper channels because what if I'm wrong, right? That's my assumption. That sounds about legitimate. I don't know if that's actually procedure, but it should be something along that line. So then they pass it off to somebody else. And then however many people get involved now have wasted their time dealing with something that I didn't have to call in the first place, right? I wasted my time seeing all those replies, and everybody wasted their time cheering it on because they're not going to like it when it happens to them. And I know this because a lot of those same people didn't like it when it was happening to them. Back when the quote old Twitter was in place, right? When it was more left supportive, more left leaning, if you will, and people were getting their accounts squashed. Well, they didn't like it then, but now that they have the upper hand because they've got somebody that's running it, that's treating Twitter a little bit differently, all of a sudden now they're going to do the same thing. Do you see how this is a problem? This does not lead to a healthy society, nor does it lead to an informed society. Instead of having a conversation about, okay, what about the separation of powers? And is this an appropriate decision by the Supreme Court? And do we think that he should have that, any president should have these kind of immunities, preclusive and absolute? And, should we make a distinction between unofficial acts and official acts? Instead of having that conversation, no, we're not having that one. What we're doing is we're having a conversation about whose Twitter account should get squashed because they quote unquote made a threat, but they didn't. That's the conversation we're having. So we're destroying our own country by not having meaningful conversations. Could the president call in SEAL Team 6 to assassinate his political rival? It seems unlikely to me, but I don't know. We're not having that conversation. And if I don't think of all the ideas, hopefully somebody else would. And then we can say, oh, that's a good point. I didn't think of that. But we're not, because we're engaging in a cult of ignorance. And it's all, trust me, if you're on Twitter, you see it every day. Cult of ignorance. It's all over the place. It's rampant. And we're no better for it. In fact, I would argue we're worse off. So with that, folks, I want to encourage you to read stuff. Or, this is tough, shut up. Quit talking if you haven't at least made somewhat of an attempt to understand what you're talking about. Now, I'm not telling you not do your research. No. I'm telling you the exact opposite. Go and do your research. Spend some time reading. Now, maybe reading court rulings is not your thing. Maybe you want to read studies about health. That's awesome. We need people in that space. We need people in other spaces. Read about things, digest them, communicate it well, hold other people accountable when they don't. And that's how we make the best society possible. And that, I would argue, is how we ensure that our constitutional republic is what it's supposed to be, which, by the way, it is not. It's not at all. And this is why. This exact reason. Because we're not putting an effort in to make sure that we understand and have healthy, meaningful debates, and then demand other people do likewise. I've seen what you guys vote into office. Looking at you folks. Don't worry. I was once part of that crowd too. I once upon a time voted in, buffoons who could not communicate very well. I supported them. Now I don't. Now my bar is a little higher, and we just need to get everybody's bar a little bit higher. All right, folks. Hope you enjoyed this episode. Hope you found it informative and inspiring. Inspiring to the point where you're going to go and read. That would be great. Like if I encouraged you to start reading something, studies about this, studies about that, Supreme Court rulings, read the bills. You don't have to just read the bills from your city council. Okay. Just go and find some and read those. Start there. Something simple, anything, but read, get out there and become more informed. And if I've encouraged you to do that, that's awesome. Then I've made a very successful podcast episode. Be sure to catch me Monday through Friday, 7 a.m. Eastern-ish, mostly, for an informed discussion on politics and culture. And make sure that you are following my YouTube channel, or if you prefer, my Rumble channel. You can go to youtube.libertydad.com or rumble.libertydad.com. While you're there, let me know how I'm doing by leaving me a comment. Except for you telemarketer scammers, please stop. Goodness, I'm tired of you guys coming along and saying, hey, I see you got great content, but you do better marketing. Yes, I know that. No, I'm not picking you. Anyway, remember, if you're a champion of liberty, your business is people and your product is liberty. I want you to have a great week. Catch you next time. But for now, I'm out.